All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the true origins of what is arguably one of the most culturally misunderstood texts in all of human history. We are reverse engineering an ancient piece of literature that completely captivated the Western imagination, but honestly, it did so for reasons that are deeply, deeply tangled in mistranslation and misinterpretation. Yep, we're talking about the text famously known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
So let's dive right into this bizarre mystery. How on earth does an ancient spiritual manuscript from the mountains of Tibet end up on the absolute must-read list for 1960s psychonauts? It's a massive, fascinating historical jump. You have a text written centuries ago, essentially serving as a highly specific spiritual manual, and then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, it's fueling the counterculture movement, shaping avant-garde art, and literally providing the lyrical foundation for some of the most famous rock and roll of the 20th century. When you trace its footprint, you see just how aggressively this text permeated Western pop culture. I mean, in 1964, Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert dropped The Psychedelic Experience, which was directly, explicitly based on the Tibetan text. Then, just 2 years later, John Lennon draws inspiration from Leary's manual and his own LSD trips to write the Beatles track Tomorrow Never Knows. Fast forward to 1990, and you've got screenwriter Bruce Joel Rubin creating the psychological horror film Jacob's Ladder, framing the whole thing as a modern interpretation of the text. It's totally woven into the fabric of modern media. But here's where it gets wild. It is so fascinating to look at how Western counterculture figures entirely repurposed the ancient material. Leary and his colleagues definitely weren't reading this as a guide for literal physical death. Instead, they construed the effects of psychedelics as a stripping away of ego defenses. They essentially looked at the Tibetan stages of death and said, hey, this perfectly matches the stages of psychological ego death. They firmly believed that reading this text could act as a Sherpa through an intense psychedelic trip, helping you shed your old self to be spiritually reborn. Okay, but to understand how we actually arrived at psychedelic ego death and Hollywood horror movies, we have to rewind. We have to go back to the pivotal year of 1927. This was the year a scholar named Walter Evans Wentz published the very first English translation of the text. Published by Oxford University Press, it was one of the first major examples of Tibetan literature ever translated into a European language. Now, this was obviously a massive milestone, but it also planted the seeds for literally almost a century of profound misunderstanding. And right out of the gate, we hit a massive roadblock, a glaring mistranslation. Evans Wentz decided to title his translation The Tibetan Book of the Dead. Why? Because he directly modeled it after the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was hugely popular at the time. It was a marketing spin. When you actually contrast his title with the real Tibetan meaning, which is liberation through hearing during the intermediate state, you realize the English title bears absolutely zero relationship to the original text. Evans Wentz completely obscured the true meaning just to make it more digestible and marketable to a Western audience. And honestly, the mistranslation went way deeper than just the cover. Because he wasn't intimately familiar with Tibetan Buddhism himself, Evans Wentz essentially shoehorned his own Hindu and theosophical beliefs into the translation. He did work with English-speaking lamas, sure, but he used a conceptual framework that was fundamentally neither Tibetan nor Buddhist to interpret what they were saying. He introduced terminology derived from Hinduism and his own Western esoteric beliefs, which heavily altered the text's essence and introduced massive systemic misunderstandings about the actual Tibetan tradition of Dzogchen. Now, this Western tendency to just map our own ideas onto Eastern texts definitely didn't go unnoticed at the time. Even the famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who literally wrote a psychological commentary for the book's third edition, was raising huge red flags about this. Jung applied his expertise to show how the phenomena in the book paralleled the unconscious mind, but he repeatedly warned Westerners against the wholesale, blind adoption of these Eastern traditions out of their native context. He totally understood that ripping a spiritual framework from its cultural roots was just a fast track to psychological confusion. So let's strip away the Western baggage for a second and look at the actual history. According to Tibetan tradition, these teachings originated way back in the 8th century with the guru Padmasambhava. He composed it, his student wrote it down, and then it was purposefully hidden away. It's what's known as a terma text, basically a spiritual time capsule or hidden treasure meant to be found when the world was ready for it. Hundreds of years later, in the 14th century, a Tibetan terton or treasure revealer named Karma Lingpa physically unearthed it. From there, it remained strictly within the Tibetan tradition until that fateful 1927 English publication.
To truly grasp what this text is trying to tell us, we have to look at the original language. The entire theology hinges on one absolutely crucial word, Bardo.
In Tibetan, bar translates to between, and do means state. So put them together, and Bardo literally means an intermediate state or an existence between. It does not simply mean physical death, like the Western title heavily implies. It refers to any transitional interval whatsoever.
The rest of the original title, grol, is just as important. Thos means hearing, and grol means liberation. But grol carries incredibly deep connotations here. It's synonymous with awakening, with nirvana. It literally means freeing yourself from illusion, unraveling, and becoming undone. So if you put it all together, the text is essentially a tool for achieving true spiritual awakening simply by hearing these specific teachings while you are in a transitional state. Now, when the text actually does deal with death, it sequentially maps out 3 distinct intermediate states. First up is the Chaikai Bardo, which is the exact moment of death where one experiences the clear light of reality. If you miss your chance for liberation there, you enter the Chonid Bardo, where you experience intense visions of reality and various Buddha forms. Finally, if you're still not liberated, you fall right into the Sidpa Bardo. This is a state of karmically driven hallucinations that eventually push your consciousness into its next physical rebirth.
But here is the thing you absolutely need to take away from this. It is beautifully, incredibly functional. This isn't just high-level, abstract theology meant to be debated in a monastery. It's a highly practical manual. It's designed to be read aloud to someone who is actively dying or has just passed. The words act like a real-time GPS for the consciousness, helping beings, whether they're highly trained meditators or just completely uninitiated everyday folks, skillfully navigate the terrifying and beautiful visions of these intermediate states without panicking. Now brace yourself, because this completely blows up the Western interpretation. The original teachings actually outline a classification of 6 bardos, not just the 3 related to death. They categorize our ordinary waking life, the state of dreaming during normal sleep, and the state of deep meditation right alongside the stages of death. That's right, waking life itself is classified as an intermediate state. This is a total paradigm shift. It shows us that the text isn't exclusively about dying at all. It's about the fundamental nature of the mind. Any momentary state of consciousness is considered a bardo because it naturally lies between our past and future existences. Every single moment provides us with a gap, a fleeting opportunity to experience reality exactly as it is, totally unobscured by the projections, attachments, and confusions of our past actions. The text is actually a manual for recognizing reality right now in the present. So, we've traveled all the way from an 8th century guru to a 1960s rock song, tearing down almost a century of mistranslation to find a deeply practical, profound guide to human consciousness. I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought. If waking life is just an intermediate state, and if we are constantly existing in the space between the past and the future, what bardo are you navigating at this very moment? Thanks so much for exploring this with me. Keep asking questions and keep looking closely at the spaces in between.